Hello, everybody out there in radio land. Y'all are listening to Oh no, sorry, that's my music show. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. As always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 WIDR or Western Michigan University, no matter how dope or insightful they may turn out to be. If you're new to the show, it's a weekly program where we come on your dial and we tell y'all what is going on here in Kalamazoo, the state of Michigan, the so-called United States, and the rest of the world from a working class perspective. As the name says, taking a critical look at the mainstream corporate media and trying to kind of dig underneath the headlines and call out the BS. If you're a long time listener, sorry about last week. I was on vacation. I was up north, did a lot of fun stuff. Went up to the Toccoman Falls, and I learned why Lake Superior will kill you. I went to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. So a fun time. I think if you were tuning in last week, you might have heard something from the archives. So hopefully you didn't go. You didn't. You got a little bit of your media ciphers fix in. I think we might be joined by my co-host later. Obviously, we've got a lot to talk about. There's some big news that happened over the course of last week. I'm sure a lot of y'all know what I'm talking about. Again, the shooting that happened in D.C. We're going to be digging into that later on in the program. Of course, we're going to come start locally. There are actually some big local stories we want to hit on before we dive into the national stuff. So. Let's first. I want to talk about something going on here in the KPS school system. This comes to us from M Live, and I'll have a little bit of commentary on here on this and how it kind of relates to austerity and some of the again budget crunching that we are seeing. But this is from M Live. It was published on May 24th. Parents petition to save school librarian after position gets axed in budget cuts. It was written by A.M. Miller, who, by the way, is former part-time co-host on the show. Always good to see Media Cyphers alumni go on to bigger and better things. Two Kalamazoo schools are losing their librarian, and parents aren't happy about it. More than 700 community members have signed a petition asking administrators at Kalamazoo Public Schools to reconsider terminating the assistant librarian position shared by Parkwood Upjohn Elementary School and Winchell Elementary School. Several KPS parents spoke at a Thursday, May 22nd school board meeting asking the district to retain the position. Parents in our neighborhood are considering whether or not Winchell was the school for them, said Robin Reed, president of Winchell's Parent Teacher Association. They're wondering how committed is KPS to the reading of their students, to the education of their students. The decision to cut the position was made by building principals in response to budget constraints, Superintendent Darren Slade said. Principals are responsible for making staffing decisions in their schools, Slade said. And it's interesting, kind of passing the buck there. But anyway, lower enrollment means smaller budgets. Enrollment at both schools is at its lowest point in the past decade. There are 520 students enrolled at Parkwood Upjohn in the 2021 through 22 school year. Enrollment fell to 427 students in 2024 through 25, according to MI school data, which that is a pretty precipitous drop. We're talking almost 100 students between the beginning of the decade and now. Anyway, enrollment declines at Winchell have been drastic, but still fell from 491, or less drastic, still fell from 491 students in 2023 through 24 to 465 students in 24 through 25. If your budget increases, you get to add somebody. If your budget decreases, you pick who you are going to reduce, Slade said, adding he understands the parent concerns and appreciates their advocacy. And again, you pick who you are going to reduce is some very interesting and flowery language for fire or terminate. Anyway, lay off, etc. For this school year, KPS employed 16 part-time library assistants. Next time, for the 2025 through 26 academic year, the district will employ 15. Nothing will change in terms of students having access to the library, Slade said. The library assistant's primary role is to check in and check out books, Slade said. The district hasn't had any full-time librarians since 2001. The temporary plan that we've currently created is to have other staff that's available during the week to go in and check out books, Slade said. Slade said KPS hasn't made drastic cuts to libraries since the early 2000s, before KPS students had access to the Kalamazoo Promise. After the Kalamazoo Promise was announced in 2008, enrollment in district schools increased as parents sought out the guaranteed college tuition. Reed says she fears making cuts to the libraries in response to budget constraints will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Winchell prides ourselves on being the reading school. We say 30 minutes a day of reading is the Winchell way, Reed said. This is not a discretionary matter. It's not something that is a luxury, and we have been told that this is something we don't have to worry about. Susan O'Connor, parent to 2 KPS students and librarian with Kalamazoo Public Library, started the petition. The Kalamazoo Promise is such a wonderful resource, but the children won't be prepared for college without basic resources like librarians, O'Connor said. KPS is going to continue to lose students if we don't invest in things that encourage parents to choose KPS. Strong libraries are one of those things. Now, this ties into several things I'd like to touch on, both at a very local and a actually kind of international level, talking about education, how we fund education, basically the problems with how the United States funds its education. And I wanted to first talk about the Kalamazoo Promise, and we've talked on the show. I'm actually one of the first classes, or the first class that got the Kalamazoo Promise. So I'm kind of dating myself, old geezer on the radio. But what should be interesting, this program that Kalamazoo has that's unique in the country, and since it was implemented about almost 20 years ago at this point, other cities and some states have tried to build a similar model of, like your Kalamazoo Promise, Michigan Promise, like some sort of free education onboarding. And the problem with that is, while it is a very nice thing for the local billionaires to do, to try to make sure all the locals can get college, without doing the work on the ground of making sure the school system itself is better, it basically becomes a gentrification engine. People who already have the resources to, get their children through school with good grades, all that other stuff, they stand to benefit more than kids, low income kids who maybe have a harder time in school and have a harder time preparing for college. And I want to contrast this with how school is funded in, say, like a socialist country, where we don't have, again, and here's another weird anomaly of the American system. Most of the funding for local schools comes from the local tax base. It depends on how robust your population is and how much wealth they have. Isn't that fun? So again, low income areas are going to have less resources than high income areas. That's class society in America. Whereas in a socialist society, there is an effort made to make sure that educational resources are evenly distributed. In fact, a specific effort is made to make sure that rural areas have the same access to educational resources as those as urban ones. Again, they are tied into, kind of the class character of the surrounding neighborhood. That is not what we have here. And so we end up in this interesting situation. And, Winchell in particular it's not a low income neighborhood. It is thoroughly middle class. However, they are feeling the hurt from this kind of funding scheme that ties the funding of schools into how many, like, again, how many kids can you get into the school, how many resources. And even a school in one of the more better off neighborhoods in Kalamazoo ends up getting pinched by this school funding model, where they're losing librarians. Now, the parents, they are all right to be in an uproar about this. We also have to remember, though, there's a lot of schools in poorer districts that never had a librarian, or don't have a good supply of books, or the teachers are often bringing in supplies. This is a problem that's only going to continue to be exacerbated as the federal government is trying to take a wrecking ball to the Department of Education and basically try to phase out public education in its entirety. So I contrast that with the system that we see in, both like capital S socialist countries like, Cuba, and some of like the social democratic countries like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, etc., with the model we have here to point out that there are better ways to do this. And, especially as we're going to be in this contention with the federal government in the years to come. I think it really gives the working class a chance to kind of rewrite the rules of the game, to see what would be a better way to fund our schools here in Kalamazoo and in Michigan, so things like this do not happen. So again, some food for thought. And if you want to read the original story, you can find it. It's at MLive, Kalamazoo Gazette, written by A. Miller. Parents petition to save school librarian after position gets axed in budget cuts. All right, we're going to take a quick little break. We come back. We've got another important story about some news coming out of the Kalamazoo County Board of Commissioners. Keep your dial locked. This is Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your source for political revolution. Hello again, everybody out there in Radio Land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. We got a big story out of the Kalamazoo Board of Commissioners. They are actually going to be bringing litigation against the Trump administration for a very interesting reason. I almost said region, but it has to do again with kind of the intersection of the kind of Trump administration's vicious austerity and climate issues. Some of you may be aware this has been one of the wildest tornado and severe weather seasons in recent Michigan history. And you may also remember just a couple weeks ago where we had those that very extreme storm that knocked down power lines and trees all over the city. And you may have noticed, like I did, that it took a long time for many people to have their power and their cable restored. Not even to speak of the all of the traffic lights and downed limbs that were making it less safe to travel about town. And, we're not just talking about like, neighborhood streets here. We're talking about major arteries. The intersection at Westnedge and Millam was down for the better part of 24 hours. And the intersection at Stadium and Howard was down for close to 48. It's again, couple of the busiest intersections in Kalamazoo being made out of necessity into four-way stops. Not to mention, again, it was very eerie. I was driving down there 2 days after the storm, Down Stadium. All the businesses were closed. It kind of reminded me of the early days of COVID. And I bring all of that up because even at the time, I was thinking, this seems really unusual. Yes, it was an intense storm, but we've had intense storms before. Why is it taking so long for all of the power and utilities to be restored? And again, part of that is because of what the Trump administration has been doing with their intense austerity measures directed at things like EPA grants. We actually saw this in, I believe it's Kentucky, where we had some tornado fatalities that were fairly directly linked to the fact that nighttime overnight meteorologists had been laid off due to budget cuts. So people were not given sufficient warning about a tornado warning. Well, those budget cuts are affecting us here too, in the form of, again, seeing some of our busiest intersections in Kalamazoo knocked out for close to 2 days. And the Kalamazoo County Board of Commissioners connected some of these dots, and they are now going to be bringing a lawsuit against the Trump administration because they stopped payments on a large grant that would have helped the local community be better prepared for last Thursday's windstorm. The $18.9 million grant from the Environmental Protection Agency would have been used to tighten up homes and harden local neighborhood centers to make them storm resistant and able to provide shelter in stormy weather. The county board met in a closed session Tuesday afternoon and later voted to join other plaintiffs. Again, this was about a week ago, May 21st. I'm reading from WKZO's coverage of it. Kalamazoo County Board suing Trump White House over EPA funding. The EPA had not only approved the money, but had already been reimbursing the county for expenses this spring when it suddenly dried up. The class action suit may have a good chance of winning if it does go forward. The Institute for Policy Integrity claims the current administration has failed nearly 93% of the time when actions by its agencies have resulted in legal challenges. Lawyers for Good Governance, the Southern Economic Law Center, and Earth Justice are the law groups leading the litigation. So, it's interesting too. We covered a few stories right after the election. We had the township, and there was some mulling about the county kind of passing these declarations or, kind of standing up against, particularly like a lot of the racial animus Trump administration has been drudging up, anti-DEI and anti-woke, which again is, a dog whistle for some pretty obvious sentiments. And some of those they don't end up going forward, but in this particular case, we have an instance where, again, you have something that is very tangible. We all experience this in a very direct way. We all were trying to drive around Kalamazoo after the windstorm, with marked difficulty trying to avoid limbs, trying to avoid, down power lines, trying to avoid traffic lights that were not operable. And you can draw a direct line between the extreme austerity that has been imposed since Trump came into office and the inconvenience and danger we all had to deal with in the days after the storm. As disaster capitalism keeps kind of just stripping away these basic guardrails that a lot of us take for granted, we're going to be seeing stuff like this a lot more often. And it's not to say that, we don't have resources at the local level that can help deal with this, but these disasters cause millions and millions of dollars in damage. I think back to the tornadoes that touched down in Portage. And even then, and this was under the Biden administration, they were having a terrible time getting the financial resources they needed from the federal government and even from the state government. They were on like something like a 2-year waiting list. So what is the solution? Well, we need a socialist federal government, but if wishes were I'm probably just end up doing a Malafor if I end up trying to close that loop there. But okay, so yeah, we don't have a socialist government. So instead, it's important, I think, to use this as a moment to kind of explain to people. It's a really hard example of this is the kind of like end stage capitalism that we have been talking about. This is how it's going to affect us in our backyard. It can be even worse next time. And like I said, while this wasn't as intense under Biden, this was also part of the status quo then. The kind of neoliberalism leans into trying to privatize and shortchange people during disasters. Whereas again, the conservatives are just trying to strip it away entirely. But we're at a point where I think it's a good way to educate, average folks on the failures of our system in a very direct way by saying, I know, and it sounds abstract when I'm out there talking about austerity and capitalism and stuff, but look, think about what happened last week. You could barely get around town. Everything, limbs down everywhere. Things were getting fixed quickly. That is because of what we've been talking about on the program, which is again austerity, and especially when you have people at the helm who are basically trying to strip the copper wiring out of the federal government. This is what happens. This is what happens. All right. We're going to take another quick little break. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. You can also find us online at our Facebook, YouTube, and the Media Cyphers podcast, which you can find on most podcasting apps. Keep it locked. This is Media Cyphers, your source for political revolution. Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the the big beautiful bill. Oh God. Which, by the way, if you didn't clock this, it's just, again, this is just how petty Donald Trump is. But you notice the alliteration, big beautiful bill is, it's an echo of when Biden was trying to build back better. Again, it's like, oh yeah, everything is just going to be chipped away and stripped for parts, so you can be snarky to the last old guy who was in office. That's great. Um, but I'm obviously, a lot of you have probably been hearing about this in your feeds and different aspects to it. And it is a 1,000+ page turd sandwich, and it would take a long time to really dive in to everything that is bad about it. I think like just the two big points you should take away from the big beautiful bill are two things that it does. It's just an absolute like night overnight robbery of the working class. All the very meager social safety net that we currently have is going to be just basically just have I used this analogy earlier, have the copper wiring stripped out of it, and all that copper is going to go to the billionaires who are going to be getting even heavier tax cuts. Again, all of the cuts to working class programs that people need are going to be funneled directly to the rich. And to the point where even a lot of you have some of these more principled fiscal conservatives like Rand Paul, who's very concerned about the deficit, talking about how this is it's going to add to the deficit, much in a similar way as the big billionaire tax cuts in the first round of the Trump administration did. But I mean, the Rand Pauls are few and far between. Most of the Republicans are just kind of getting in line with this. It's in the House. It passed the House. It's in the Senate now. There's a whole other story about how it only passed in the House because several Democratic representatives died because they're too old, and how Democrats let really old, senile people remain in charge. Dianne Feinstein, Joe Biden, et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole other story. Maybe we'll cover it. I mean, that might be something for me and Lawrence to talk about. But the not again, the main takeaway from the big beautiful bill is that it robs from the poor, gives to the rich, and also tries to demolish some of the very meager guardrails that do exist for an autocrat like Donald Trump. Again, it takes away a lot of the power of the courts. It basically gives more power for the president to ignore those court orders. And it's, yeah, again, very much like, you know Donald Trump slipped a little post-it note to the Republican legislators. It's like, okay, just let me have king powers, please. And most of them were like, sir, yes, sir, except for a couple where it's like, okay, we'll give you king powers, but I don't want it to add to the deficit. I got to be principled about this. Um, But there's this good article from Bridge, Michigan, because again, we always try to localize our coverage, that dives into what it would mean for Michiganders. It was published on May 23rd, written by Lauren Gibbons. And I'm going to go down and again, you can read the entire article. I wanted to start on when it starts talking about Medicaid, because I mean, this is something that affects most of the people I know listening. My father's on Medicaid. I have other family members on Medicaid. If the cuts end up being as severe as the Republicans want, it's going to really, put a lot of people we care about in danger. So, um, go ahead and quote from the article. To offset costs of other cuts, the proposal includes reduced spending on Medicaid, including through work requirements that would begin December 31st, 2026. All told, the Congressional Budget Office estimates the changes would net roughly $700 billion in savings for the federal government. In Michigan, Medicaid provides health insurance to more than 2.6 million people, or 1 in 4 state residents, primarily with lower than average incomes. The federal government spent $584 billion on Medicaid in 2024, up from $52.5 billion in 1991. Under the GOP plan, able adults without dependents would need to provide proof twice a year of at least 80 hours of completing community engagement requirements, such as work, education, or service to keep their coverage. Medicaid expansion enrollees could also see copays of up to $35. Again, it's this kind of what's work-based requirements that University of Michigan professors Donald Moynihan and Pamela Hurd said in a statement would create administrative burdens that could result in otherwise eligible people losing access to health insurance. To be sure, they work, but only if your goal is to reduce access to services, while largely failing to increase labor market participation. They are already, they are especially damaging to vulnerable populations, such as those who are already in poor health. The proposal would also freeze provider taxes that Michigan and other states use to leverage federal funding for Medicaid. A provision to block coverage for undocumented immigrants likely would not impact Michigan, which already limits eligibility to citizens and legal residents. States like Michigan, where the vast majority of Medicaid funds come from the federal government, would have to figure out how to reduce services, trim people from the program, or backfill the cuts with millions of dollars from other programs, public safety and infrastructure, for example. And let me just make it very clear, considering how hesitant municipalities are to defund the police, it's probably going to be infrastructure and other things that we rely on, like maybe a storm response, for instance. Anyway, the magnitude is hard to wrap your head around because we just don't have the resources at the state level to backfill a cut of this nature. State Budget Director Jen Flood recently told Bridge, Michigan. It also talks about SNAP benefits. The proposal would also result in an estimated $285.7 billion with a B reduction in federal spending over the next decade for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the federal food stamp program that supports roughly 1.5 million people in Michigan. Changes suggested in the House Republican plan include capping annual increases in benefits, as well as expanding existing work requirements for food assistance to older adults and parents of children over the age of 7. States would also have to cover some costs of the program and would have less flexibility to waive certain work requirements. A Congressional Budget Office analysis estimated 3.2 million people nationwide in an average month would lose benefits over the next decade under the changes, including roughly 800,000 adults living with children age 7 or older. So just to make it very clear, again, taking food out of children's mouths so we can give a big fat check to the richest people in America. Going on. Also talks a little bit about electric vehicles and clean energy credits. On this first day in office, Trump vowed to end a so-called electric vehicle mandate and wind down green energy initiatives backed by former President Biden. That includes a $7,500 tax credit for consumer purchases of new electric vehicles, which Trump promised to eliminate during Michigan campaign stops. Those tax subsidies would end under the proposed legislation. Also on the chopping block, tax credits incentivizing clean energy production from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, which coincided with several major federal investments in Michigan projects. Trump previously rescinded a Biden order that established a national goal for 50% of all cars in the U.S. to be zero emissions by 2030 and directed the EPA to establish related emissions and fuel economy standards. Those rules did not amount to a mandate for electric vehicle production or purchases, though Trump and his allies claimed they did. Revoking the rules could be a lengthy process, but Trump's order made clear his administration intends to do so. These changes could have a significant impact on Michigan automakers, which have already committed billions of dollars to transition to EVs and build batteries. Anyway, if you want to read that entire article, you can find that at Bridge, Michigan. From Taxes to Medicaid, What Trump's Big, Beautiful Bill Would Mean for Michigan. It was written by Lauren Gibbons and published on May 23rd. We're going to take another break. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. You can also find us online at Media Cyphers on Facebook, YouTube, and the Media Cyphers Kalamazoo podcast you can find on most podcasting apps. Please tell your friends. The algorithms ain't doing us any favors because we're a bunch of, radical left dirtbags and stuff. So please, if you like the show, tell your friends about it. Tell them to subscribe. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers, your source for political revolution. Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. So we're going to be spending the next few stories talking about, again, the conflict in Palestine. I'm not going to start with the shooting. We'll get to that. But I wanted to focus more on, again, the people who are standing up to repression, the nature of that repression, and we will talk a little bit again about that specific incident in just a little bit. But first, again, because we're broadcasting out of the university, it is commencement season. There's been a lot of graduations going on. And there's this great story from Left Voice focusing on how a lot of graduates have been using their platform when they're doing their valedictorian speeches and whatnot, commencement speeches, to hit on the genocide going on in Gaza. So this article is written by Otto Fors. It was published May 22nd. U.S. students protest Israel's genocide and universities' complicity in commencement speeches. Bad news for universities. For all their attempts to repress the movement for Palestine on campus, students are still protesting Israel's genocide. At several commencement ceremonies, speakers have denounced the atrocities and called out their university's complicity. On May 14th, New York University graduate Logan Rozos said from the podium, "The only thing that is appropriate to say in this time and to a group this large is a recognition of the atrocities currently happening in Palestine." He added, "The genocide currently occurring is supported politically and militarily by the United States, is paid for by our tax dollars, and has been live streamed to our phones for the last 18 months. A few days later, Cecilia Culver of George Washington University in Washington, D.C., went further in her speech, saying, "I am ashamed to know my tuition is being used to fund this genocide. I call upon the class of 2025 to withhold donations and continue advocating for disclosure and divestment." Universities are trying to respond, denouncing the students and swiftly punishing them. NYU is withholding Rozos's diploma, claiming he abused his speaking privileges to express personal and one-sided political views. By the way, I think everybody should be anti-genocide. I don't really think the other side of that argument is worth hearing, but anyway, I'll go ahead and go on. Columbia University, a focal point of last year's campus encampments, also saw commencement protests. Demonstrators rallied outside the university gates, and some burned or tore up their diplomas. At the ceremony, acting President Claire Shipman faced loud boos and chants of Free Mahmoud, in reference to Columbia graduate Mahmoud Khalil, who has been in detention for more than 70 days over his pro-Palestine activism, reawakening the movement amid a genocidal crescendo. These students' actions and universities' crackdowns come at a time when Israel's genocide is reaching a bloody crescendo. The Zionist state has intensified its attacks on Gaza as part of Operation Gideon's Chariots and has blocked almost all humanitarian aid since early March. The United Nations warns that up to 14,000 babies could die imminently without aid. Israeli politicians, meanwhile, are revealing their intentions. Netanyahu has emphasized that Israel aims to seize control of the entire Gaza Strip. His far-right ally, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, declared Gaza will be entirely destroyed, and Palestinians will be expected to leave in great numbers. In short, genocide and ethnic cleansing, a policy the Zionist state is also escalating in the West Bank. Opposition to Israel, however, continues to grow. The climate on college campuses may not be as intense as it was during the peak of spring 2024 encampments, but these commencement protests indicate that the student movement for Palestine remains strong, influencing young people who are aware of the Zionist state's genocide, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid. And it's not just students. Opposition to Israel is growing among U.S. adults, and last week saw significant international protests for Nakba Day. Amid the intensified genocide against Gazans and ongoing crackdowns on students, it's essential that we continue to mobilize for a free Palestine. This includes supporting brave graduates like Rozos and Culver, urging universities to lift their punitive measures, drop charges against other students for their pro-Palestine activism, and divest entirely from Israel. We must also broaden the movement to end the genocide and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. This requires collaboration that extends beyond campuses. The student and labor movements need to unite under independent working class politics, mobilizing in workplaces, campuses, and the streets for a free Palestine, and to chip away at U.S. imperialism. That is article from Otto Fors from Left Voice. U.S. students protest Israel's genocide and universities' complicity in commencement speeches. From there, I wanted to move to an article about basically a really fascinating piece that is also very urgent, and it's kind of talking about the repressive playbook that the government is going to be kind of deploying against, anti-genocide voices and leftists more broadly in this moment that, again, has a lot of historical echoes and parallels with the era of McCarthyism, when, again, the federal government was most overtly cracking down on the U.S. left. But there's this article by Schuler Mitchell from Truth Out that I thought was worth reading in full to my audience here. But it's about something called Project Esther. And I'm going to go ahead and read from the article. Project Esther is a McCarthy-era blueprint for crushing the American left. While the Heritage Foundation document focuses on the Palestine solidarity movement, its ultimate target is far broader. Project Esther isn't just about Palestine. Crafted by the Heritage Foundation, the same far-right organization behind Project 2025, the playbook purports to provide a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. First published and reported on last year, the document has seen new life in recent days following a New York Times investigation into Trump administration policies that mirror the plan. But Project Esther's authors make clear that their war on the Gaza solidarity movement is just a Trojan horse for a far more ambitious project, destroying the American left. Mainstream coverage of Project Esther has largely framed the document as an effort to crush the pro-Palestinian movement. It's important to emphasize, however, that the threat Project Esther poses to the left more broadly is not a byproduct, it's part of the plan's core design. The text lays bare the McCarthyist nature of this political moment and underscores the urgent need for the left to mount a multi-pronged coalitional defense. At the center of Project Esther's crosshairs are the people and organizations it dubs the Hamas Support Network, or HSN. though there's no evidence that the entities it's targeting actually support Hamas or that they are even organized in any sort of network. The playbook proposes a slew of recommendations for dismantling this fictional network, including deporting international students, purging pro Palestine faculty from educational institutions, defunding organizations, increasing criminalization, and promoting social ostracization of people that speak out in support of Palestinian rights. Within the United States, the HSN receives the indispensable support of a vast network of activists and funders with a much more ambitious, insidious goal: the destruction of capitalism and democracy. Oh, no. Actually, I don't know. We've talked about this on the show. I personally think capitalism is antithetical to democracy. You know, what with kind of rich people being able to run everything. But yeah, what do I know? Anyway, this, of course, is pure projection. There is no vast network of funders behind the grassroots uprising for Palestine, unlike Project 2025, which is crafted by 100 conservative organizations and, as the Smog reported, bankrolled by 6 billionaire families. This actually reminds me of a really funny FBI report from a few years ago, trying to figure out who was funding Antifa. And what they basically came back was like, these people don't have any money. This is they have communal kitchens and like they just have like regular jobs. As they were almost kind of stunned at yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know if George Soros is giving them money, but definitely not spending it on the Antifa. Anyway, by attempting to frame the Gaza solidarity movement as a well-funded and cohesive network, Project Esther clearly aims to implicate any and all organizations on the left, a target that includes, but is not limited to, people and organizations that have spoken out in defense of Palestine. The goal is demonstrated in Project Esther's repeated claim that the so-called HSN is seeking to destroy capitalism, which carries clear echoes of Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunts of the 1950s. Which, by the way, I mean, there's if you put a Venn diagram of like people who are against the genocide in Palestine and people who are anti-capitalist, it's a pretty significant overlap. But yeah, it is inaccurate to say that everybody who is against the genocide is anti-capitalist. I mean, nominally, there's a lot of hyper-capitalist Arab countries that are very much against what Israel is doing. They don't want to see capitalism overthrown. Um, yeah, okay. Me, on the other hand, yeah, it's like, quote, Hans Moleman from the system, or from Hans Moleman from The Simpsons, like paraphrase, like, I was talking about destroying capitalism. Anyway, the project goes so far as to ludicrously equate the Communist Manifesto with Mein Kampf, which, as you might recall if you know your history, the Soviets fought against the Nazis in World War II. Not to mention, the first order of business in Nazi Germany was to go after the communists and the socialists. It's right there in the famous poem. Anyway, anyway, I mean that's a rhetorical tool of the right. Oh, they were called National Socialists. We have to explain often in the same way that buffalo wings are not actually from Buffalo. Nazism is not actually socialist by any stretch of the imagination. They were a very hyper capitalist mode of production. In fact, most serious scholars of fascism understand it as kind of like the end stage of capitalism. When it has a hard time really holding everything together, it has to seek a more again overtly oppressive structure. Anyway, the proposals offered up by Project Esther can also be traced back to those witch hunts of the 50s. One of the Project Esther's suggested tools for quashing pro-Palestine activism, well, it goes before the 50s too, anyway, is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, a law enacted in 1938 to combat Nazi propaganda, which requires that agents of foreign countries register with the Department of Justice and periodically disclose their political activities, and creates criminal and civil penalties for noncompliance. Although FARA was intended to provide transparency around foreign lobbying, it was co-opted for McCarthyist oppression or suppression in the 50s to paint left activists as agents of communist regimes. In one egregious abuse of power, the DOJ used FARA to prosecute renowned civil rights leader and historian W.E.B. Du Bois for his perceived communist sympathies. That case was dismissed, but Project Esther is now urging federal leadership to pull from the same playbook, painting leftist activists and groups as Hamas supporters to tee up its own weaponization of the FARA. And Republicans have already expanded their use of the foreign agent rhetoric beyond Hamas. Last month, Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, accused the People's Forum, a New York-based community center, and Code Pink, an anti-war group, of ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and urged the DOJ to investigate the group for FARA violations. The Trump administration levied similar allegations against Harvard University in a May 22nd post on X, claiming that the school has coordinated with the CCP and fostered anti Semitism on campus. Citing a quote unquote pro Hamas campus environment, an accompanying letter from Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announced that the administration is barring Harvard from enrolling international students. Many on the left have highlighted how the government's crackdown on pro-Palestine groups is itself in service of the Israeli state and its foreign lobbyists in the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. But pointing out Project Esther's hypocrisy does little to undermine its mission, which hinges on equating anti-Zionism with anti-Americanism. This sleight of hand is how Project Esther widens its scope of attack, pointing out that the Zionist lobbyists are the real foreign agents ultimately obfuscates the deeper root of the problem: the deployment of money and imperial power, regardless of where they originate, in support of policies of apartheid and ethnic cleansing, while also capitulating to Project Esther's framing of Palestinian liberation as having anything to do with being pro or anti-American. Which, again, to paraphrase Hans Molman, everybody's like, being pro-Palestinian doesn't mean I'm anti-American. It's like, I always said I was being anti-American. By the way, I can say that. I do not like this country. I don't like where this country is at. And I have the First Amendment, so I could say that. Anyway, this country does need to build back better. Anyway, maybe from scratch. Anyway, we've seen going on by weaponizing RICO against the Even more concerning than FARA, however, is Project Esther's recommendation that the government use the RICO Act to persecute activists. That's Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, which was originally developed to go after the mob, by the way. By weaponizing RICO against the pro-Palestine movement, the Trump administration could ensnare people and groups across the left in a massive policing dragnet, attempting to paint everyone from anti-capitalists to Black Lives Matter activists as Hamas supporters. We've already seen RICO weaponized in Georgia against the defund the Atlanta Forest movement, where Attorney General Chris Carr indicated 61 protesters on flimsy racketeering charges. Prosecutors claimed in legal filings that the fight to stop a massive police training center began during the nationwide protests against George Floyd's murder by police in 2020. Project Esther's authors also invoke George Floyd's name, making clear they perceive all mass mobilizations against injustice as threats. The document claims that the pro-Palestine movement is using Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel as a George Floyd-style event to spring onto center stage and grab a giant microphone. Crucially, while Project Esther claims to be about combating anti-Semitism, no major Jewish organizations participated in its drafting, and the blueprint targets progressive Jewish groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. Only one of the 4 people on the project leadership task force is Jewish, while 2 are evangelical Christian Zionists, and the document notably does not make any mention of right-wing anti-Semitism. And just as a reminder, if people didn't grow up around like right-wing Christian Zionists, their whole dog in this fight is they think there's going to be a giant war over there to fulfill the book of the Revelations, and all of the Jewish people are going to die so that Jesus can come back. So, actually, that sounds pretty anti-Semitic to me, but anyway, let's going on. Ironically, Project Esther claims that the pro-Palestine movement is a threat to the foundations of the United States and the fabric of our society. But the glaring lack of Jewish voices that went into crafting the document, coupled with the draconian, far-reaching tactics it proposes, should dispel any lingering doubt about the project's true aims. An Assault on Democracy and the Overall Suppression of the Left. That was written by Schuler Mitchell. Again, you can find that article on Truthout. Project Esther is a McCarthy era blueprint for crushing the American left. I'm going to just take another quick break here. We come back. We've got some more to talk about as far as what is going on with the genocide in Gaza. Keep your dial locked. This is Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. You can also find us online at Media Cyphers on Facebook, YouTube, and the Media Cyphers Kalamazoo podcast, which you can find on most podcasting apps. Keep your dial locked. This is Media Cyphers, your source for political revolution. Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. So we've got a little bit more to talk about on today's show. We got one last story related to Gaza to talk about, and then we are going to be using the rest of the time on our episode to go back in time. That is the 5th year anniversary of the uprisings that were spurred by the murder of George Floyd. And we're going to go back to the archives to some of our coverage from that year, talking about how those uprisings manifested themselves right here in Kalamazoo. But of course, probably one of the biggest stories from last week, we had a um, again, one of those shootings that is so common in the United States of America happened in Washington, D.C., outside of an event hosted at, oh gosh, what was it? Jewish History Museum, I believe. Two people were killed who were employed at the Israeli embassy. Now, I've got to talk a little bit about the politics of it, of course. I also do want to talk a little bit about the media around it. And, again, it's easy to say, and many people have been saying, kind of the qualifier behind this is, it is never right to just go out and murder people in cold blood. And, of course, yes, we agree with that on this show. But as the picture has kind of unfolded, and as we are contrasting that with the media, how the media has been and again, this is Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, of all, New York Times, etc., have all been echoed. This was an anti-Semitic attack. This was an anti-Semitic attack. This was an anti-Semitic attack. And one of the interesting things you will find if you actually dig into the story, the shooter's own words in his manifesto paint a pretty precise picture of what he is doing and why he is doing it. And he is not doing it because he hates Jewish people. He is doing it because he is sick and he is fed up with watching this live streamed genocide go down in the Gaza Strip. Now, obviously, none of us have to agree with his actions, but we have to understand the context under which those actions happen. And in this case, it's somebody who, again, was kind of pushed over the edge by what they were witnessing and experiencing, and basically, acted violently in response. And for it's interesting that an Israeli diplomat went on to say that Rodriguez was actually at the event and basically cased his targets before he shot them, which is an interesting thing, I think, for the ambassador to admit. Of course, I think it would be better propaganda for the Israeli state if this guy had just shot some random people stepping out of an event. But by saying that, like, oh no, he picked out a couple of people on purpose for very specific reasons. That again, it kind of leads into, or at least gives more credibility to the alleged manifesto that dropped online. I'm not going to, again, read it. So, some of you may have read. Some people are getting in trouble for citing this or reading this. I'm talking about again a popular left YouTuber slash Twitch streamer, Hassan Piker, was suspended from Twitch for citing and reading directly from the manifesto. Um, but I will say that again, the shooter is very clear about why they are doing what they are doing. And it is very clear that it is because they are against the genocide, they're against the Israeli state, but they're not against Jewish people. Nowhere in the document is anything about that. In fact, one of his primary targets was a Christian Zionist who, for their part, had been engaging in genocide denial online. I don't know if we ended up having a conversation about that. And, you know, for our part, of course, it is tragic. Any murder is tragic, it's tragedy. But again, the way the media is painting, these people as entirely innocent, like let's look at an analogous situation. Let's say you had a Holocaust denier that you were talking to, and they had affiliation with like the Ku Klux Klan, and somebody shot them outside. Now, we should grieve for that life, and we should grieve for that person could have been, and they chose not to be in the Ku Klux Klan or been a Holocaust denier. But yeah, that again, there's something to be said about the morality of these victims and the way the media is trying to basically paint them as this innocent couple in love again, which they do not have the niceties to provide for the thousands and thousands of Palestinians who've been murdered by the Israeli state, who by definition, a lot of those headlines are are numbers that just accidentally got hit by a bomb or something. Again, we are seeing the tide turn a little bit in the wake of this artificial famine that the Israeli state is imposing on the people of Gaza, and even some more overtly pro-Zionist outlets like the Atlantic are finally coming out and saying that the Israeli state has gone too far. But what we're witnessing is a couple of things, and one is it's blowback. And for any government to expect that they could gleefully engage in 18 months of genocide, post selfies of themselves with people stolen underwear, et cetera, talk casually about sniping children, all that, to think that's not going to boomerang back home at some point is frankly a little naive. People are human beings. People are going to react in different ways to this kind of thing. And if you're like this Rodriguez fella, maybe one day it's one video too many of a starving child, or maybe something like what we just saw of like a young girl walking out of a fire, her entire family burned to death by an IDF airstrike. Maybe it's just one video too much. And if you're in America, you know America. It's when the only tool you have is a gun, every problem looks like a bullet. And again, I'm saying this as somebody who, I know I'm not necessarily anti-gun. I have an AK in my closet, but it's important to point out that you know it's a failure to look at the situation as anything other than it is a failure of the American left and the progressive people to organize, that people have basically been pushed to such a high level of despair that all they can think to do is engage in this type of action, which, and again, the manifesto is very interesting because they even recognize that this is not necessarily something that is going to be quote unquote like good for the cause, or it's going to like lead to change, but it is the act of desperation. It's that same desperation that led Luigi Mangione to New York, or Rodney Harrington to seek his revenge against the police. And the big takeaway I think we should get from this is that, you know, America and our organizational institutions have failed when, again, people have gotten to such a point of despair that this is the only solution that they can comprehend. Because, again, how could we actually tangibly stop this genocide? We could do a general strike. We could stop the weapons from going out of the ports. But, you know, Americans can buy a gun. Americans can shoot. Some Americans can shoot well. But Americans cannot organize at that scale. They are not organizing at that scale. We're closer to organizing at that scale than we have in a long time, but we're nowhere near close. And in that way, uh, I think, like, again, that is a way that we have failed Ilyas Rodriguez. That is a way we have failed the people of Palestine and Gaza. That is a way we failed ourselves because we need to organize at such a level that we can stop this stuff. And I don't mean just, organizing encampments. We need to stop it at the source of production. We need to organize labor unions. We need to organize where we can actually choke out the war machine at its source. We have not been capable of doing that, which leads to things like Elias Rodriguez and to Luigi Mangione and Harrington. And I've got a message for the ruling class. This stuff is just going to keep happening. It's not going to stop, especially the way this current administration is squeezing people harder and harder and harder. It's kind of amazing this hasn't been more common before. But again, a boiling pot is eventually going to boil over, and that's what we're seeing right now. And without any sort of organizational capacity, this is what a lot of that is going to look like. People taking justice into their own hands because they just cannot take the horror anymore. And as I mentioned a lot of this too when I was talking about Luigi, the death of that healthcare CEO wasn't going to fix the healthcare system. The death of these two embassy staffers is not going to stop the genocide. But I think it does show just the desperation that a lot of people who are just watching this genocide unfurl in real time are feeling when, again, the public opinion has swayed against this genocide, but the government's still doing it. And they basically said, we're going to continue to do it. And the Israeli government is gleefully, just overtly talking about ethnic cleansing and getting them out of Gaza. And again, the president wants to build a casino resort there. So what we are left with is this story that, again, is going to be used and has been used in overtime to try to blame anyone and everyone, except for the genociders, for the deaths of these two individuals. We had not a representative from the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, went on CNN and said it was Hassan's fault. Hassan Piker. If you don't watch him, he's on Twitch, YouTube. He's one of the more popular left presences online, which led most likely to him getting a ban on Twitch. They're going to try to clamp down on these voices that they perceive as, again, spreading a terrorist sympathy or sentiment, which of course is their code for people who are against genocidal warfare. Now, I've talked a lot about on the show that, like, the genie is thoroughly out of the bottle. You could ban all of these media personalities. My show could get pulled off the air tomorrow, but that does not delete the last 18 months of history. People know about it. They see what is going on. I mean, some people haven't been paying attention, but that's America. Some people just don't pay attention. But anyway, what you need to watch out for now is the way they're going to try to weaponize this event. They've talked a lot and made a lot of hay about the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and that as a vector of something that radicalized Elias Rodriguez, and really, again, emphasizing that they're an anti-capitalist, anti-Zionist group, which, again, personally guilty as charged as well. But what they're really trying to do again is double down, use this event and use this image of this young couple to try to reverse the sympathy or empathy people have for starving and bombed children. That's not going to work. And even in the past, where incidences like this have kind of been able to buffer sympathy and sentiment for the Israeli state, I think we're past that. This is 2025. It is not 2015. It is not 2005. Yes, that was a sad thing that happened, but it's not going to distract from the fact that thousands and thousands of children are being deliberately starved in Gaza at this very moment and are continuing to be bombed um, and assaulted. And no amount of media propaganda is going to be able to reverse that. You know, again, the ADL is doing the rounds, trying to equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and the target is maybe going to shift towards these parties. And you know that's something that drew my attention as somebody. I'm part of the Socialist Party USA, and there's kind of a small group of these anti-capitalist political parties that do exist. PSL has been probably one of the more effective ones in the last couple of decades of really building up their numbers. And as the propaganda machine is really flailing, they are increasingly going to be setting their eyes and their target on people and groups that have been educating people about the truth of what is going on in the apartheid state of Israel. So it's something that we all need to look out for. And I think, again, everything else, you know, Netanyahu trying to say that free Palestine is the new Heil Hitler, which is kind of, you know, again, that's very ironic coming from probably the person in one of the people in contemporary politics who most closely resembles that other fellow. But um, it is important not to be scared off or to be cowed by this rhetoric about, you know, again, clamping down on people who are pursuing the truth and who want the genocide to end. It is more important than ever to be loud and to talk about this issue and point out what the Israeli state is doing to Gaza. So anyway, we'll link to all of that stuff in our show notes. I want to thank y'all again for listening. This has been Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. You can also find us online at Media Cyphers on Facebook, YouTube, and the Media Cyphers Kalamazoo podcast that we have on most podcasting apps. The next 30 minutes, we're going to go back to, like I said earlier in the show, this is the 5th anniversary of the George Floyd uprisings. So we are going to go back to a report that we did called The Police State Hits Home. And it's a reflection on the events of May 30th through June 2nd that happened right here in Kalamazoo after the murder of George Floyd. And we'll be playing a 30-minute excerpt of that report where we're talking about, again, eyewitnesses on the ground, our reflections on the community, police response, how local press covered it, all of that stuff. So keep your dial locked. This is Media Cyphers, your source for political revolution. Until next time, keep on fighting for that revolution solution.